So many interesting aspects in Crystal's presentation, both along the lines of accountability and bias. Now we'll explore one of the most important and also for some controversial areas, D&I Dashboard Using Data for Evidence-Based Actions. In D&I, we have Monika Bentkowska, Joanna Gembal, and Sandra Subel joining us. Hello, I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, hello,
yes, we do.
I'm sure I could spend the 30 minutes allocated to us just explaining your background and experience, and I feel I should be sharing at least some of it with our audience. To start with you, Monika. Reading your function alone, Country President and Human Resources Director, Regional Diversity and Inclusion Director for Continental Europe. I mean, how impressive is that? Not only you have 3 major roles, but also a company that has a complex D&I framework to manage. So that in itself is impressive, Monika. We have Joanna Gembal, Inclusion and Diversity Lead, representing Accenture. Accenture created the solution called Aware, which uses data and AI approach on Oracle Data Lakehouse to support the companies and accelerate diversity and inclusion initiatives in Poland. You're developing a solution like that in cooperation with Diversity Hub, as I understand. Hello again, Joanna.
Yes, I'm very happy to cooperate. Thank you. Hello, everybody.
And we're most happy to have you on this panel. Sandra, your approach to D&I suppose, is as evidence-based as it gets. You have a lot of respect for this approach, I take it, on top of the fact that yours is a global perspective on D&I. You like to look at D&I trends and developments globally. So let's start with the underlying question of the topic of this discussion, that is, why should D&I be measured? Of course, when I ask why should it be measured, it already entails that it should be measured. So perhaps I should be asking, should D&I be measured and how? Who would like to address this question first? Feel free to volunteer.
I will dare to start. I will start with a bit ironic statement or quite of a truism: measure what matters. And as the aspiration of all D&I professionals is to make D&I part of a day-to-day business and part of the business strategy, making it measurable and finding the ways of doing that, it's essential to positioning the diversity and inclusion agenda in that area. We don't want to keep D&I in the space of event management and initiative now and then, but really making it part of the D&I of the company. And as we measure our financial performance, why shouldn't we measure something that matters to us as much as diversity and inclusion?
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Thank you. Joanna,
okay, may I add something? Yes, definitely. So I would like to state that awareness is something which we need to run any change. So if we want to become real, inclusive and diverse organization, we need to be aware where we are now in the terms of those topics. And then we need to strategize and to set very bold goals to reach them. And when we want to do this, we need to be aware where we are on our journey to this. And this is why the measurement of all I&D aspects is so important, just to be aware where we are and how we are progressing to this.
Absolutely. Monika.
Yes, as Joanna said, of course, it's a lot about awareness, but I would add one more. It's about to track the hard data. There is a lot of beliefs, well thinking. We have around D&I initiatives, projects, areas, etc. So let's start to measure what we really do as we measure our business goals. So let's measure also the return of investment of our D&I initiatives. And also referring to what Sandra said, I don't want D&I is perceived as a nice HR initiative, something as a nice to have in our organization. It really impacts our business results. So let's start to measure that.
So what are the priorities of measurement if we were to, I'm sure Sandra is happy everyone agrees with her statement. What are the priorities for this measurement, now that we talk about it, for people who have, let's say, comparatively less knowledge of where they should start? What should one measure in the first place?
I can give you a typical consultant answer. I wanted to start with a typical consultant answers, and maybe then Joanna can pick up on that, because I wanted to say it depends. I think it totally depends on the organization you're in, the business context you're in, the workforce you have, the aspiration, the strategy you're driving. And without knowing those factors, saying, I don't know, gender should be the topic to go for everyone, might be very harmful to the agenda of gender itself. So unfortunately, there is no clear answer to the question, because it really depends on the context. But perhaps Joanna can further build on that or challenge my perspective.
Like to challenge it, because I agree. I just want to add that it really depends. Yes, and with this I agree. It depends on the complexity.
So much for the challenge.
Yeah. So this is, it depends on the complexity of our organization. So I believe that first we should measure where we are to understand the complexity of our workforce. So if we already know this, then we can think what are the groups that we should focus on. And then
Joanna, but can we try and deconstruct what it actually means, where we are? What parameters are we talking about? What aspects are we talking about?
Yeah, there can be a variety of these. So first of all, which comes to our mind perhaps is gender, right? So then we can measure how our workforce is structured in terms of ethnicity, in terms of age, etc., etc. So there are a lot of characteristics that we can measure. But having all of them in one place, then we can decide on which of them we want to focus first. And then we can, set up goals, etc., etc., etc. So the starting point is to know what is the structure and what kind of characteristics related to workforce we have in place.
But I think that there is no one set of metrics, D&I metrics, we would like to measure in each company. We should have kind of personalized approach. And again, as we said at the beginning, perhaps our discussion is a little bit boring because we agree, three of us. But as we said at the beginning, that our D&I metrics should go with our strategy. I mean, with the strategy of the company. So again, what is the structure of the company? What are the business lines we would like to develop? What kind of resources in terms of people do we need? Is it really gender balance something we need to focus on at this moment of time? Or it's more about employment of disabled people, for example? So first, let's discuss about our strategy, and then let's see what are the metrics we should measure really to prove and to show the return of the investment.
Mm-hmm. Whether the discussion is boring, it depends. Having said that, should one measure predominantly or primarily diversity, or does it matter more, for whatever reasons now, to measure inclusion?
It depends. I think the title of the panel should be "It Depends." D&I dashboards, but I will stick to that. It really depends, and I think what we are measuring should be a very conscious and informed decision, right? Because not all information about the employees we have available in the systems, and sometimes that means running so-called self-identification or diversity surveys across workforce, which aims at collecting more information than it's traditionally collected. For instance, when it comes to sexual orientation, caregiving responsibilities that goes beyond parenthood, be it education, or other identities that are not part of the traditional employment forms at the beginning, right? And if we want to approach employees with all those difficult questions when it comes to their identity and sensitive questions at the same time, we need to have a clarity what we want to do with that data and how we will address the learnings coming from that. Because asking employees to provide that data without clear strategy for using it, just for the sake of being aware and having a nice colorful dashboard in front of us, I would call it unfair towards employees and our workforce. So essential questions, a question to ask: what do we want to do with that information coming from employees?
Fair enough. So there are two ways to collect information we need to manage D&I. One way to do it is to ask employees to share some sensitive information. The other is to collect the data from the reports we have available anyway. So if I were to steer away from the depends part of our conversation, if I were to ask you where to look for the key information, which is D&I relevant, what would they be? Is it predominantly HR reports, CR reports? And should D&I be driven by hard data predominantly? In other words, what kind of data does the management need to drive D&I in the organization?
Okay, so maybe let me take this question first. I will not say it depends now. I will say definitely hard data are really important to strategize inclusion and diversity as such. And I want to refer to the solution that you mentioned at the very beginning. So I believe that there are a lot of data in HR systems which we can use to see our diversity. But it is also very important how we want to manage those data, how we want to calculate, how we want to analyze them, and how we want to visualize them. And also, which we also need to consider, is how to make sure that those data, very sensitive ones, are really secure. And this comes from the answer can come from technology. And one of the solutions to manage those data is Aware, which is the solution which we developed in Accenture, allows to gather the data from various HR systems like Oracle, SAP, Workday, etc., combine them and present the results in very aggregated way. Also allowing to present in very clear way different level of details. So I think that the technology can be really the good answer for managing, gathering, and processing the data.
And yes, Sandra?
I may, Sandra?
Sure. Monika, please.
I wish it was in person. I just wanted to add on that what Joanna just said completely resonates with me, but poses the fundamental questions. What is the quality of your data that you have, right? I rarely meet companies that are tracking gender beyond binary perspective, for instance. So it's very powerful to have such tool and work with that tool, assuming that the quality of the data it's in the right level. Sorry, Monika, for interrupting.
Monika, the stage is yours. Unmute, please. We can't hear you.
Normally, you should hear me. I'm
now
unmuted.
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So sorry for that. So I'm the fan of hard data. I'm an HR and D&I person, but I really like hard data. But I would add one more element to our discussion. It's about surveys. It's about to ask our people how they feel within the organization, and do they feel safe enough to reveal some information about them, for example, sexual orientation. There is this kind of information, we cannot see them. There is no this information in our HR reports. But for example, in the annual engagement survey now we have in Sodexo, we ask the question about sexual orientation, of course, with the option for people who don't want to ask to not to ask. But what is important for us is to know how many of them decided to answer the question. Doesn't matter the answer is, but do they feel safe enough in their small environment with their managers, with their colleagues, to speak with the loud voice about such a sensitive data? So hard data from one side, but this part of survey, let's say, data on top.
Monika, now that you've mentioned, you sort of got into my trap, so to say. You said you loved data. Inevitable question here is, what kind of data do you especially love in the context of Sodexo to effectively manage D&I? Again, we can't hear you. Yeah, now it's better. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is something on the line. So I'm too fast, perhaps. So
Maybe.
we measure a lot of different D&I data. Of course, about gender balance, disability.
A lot of is only slightly better than depends.
Okay, so gender balance is one of the first we measure, but for example, we are also focused on disability, because in European countries we know that there is this legal quota between 2 up to 6%. The legal quota we should, the number of the percentage of disabled people we should have among our organization. But on the other hand, we know that disabled people, they are almost 15% of our populations. Yeah? So then why this quota is so low? Do we need really to stick to the legal quota, or we should measure something and check something else as well? So genders, disability, generations. We have 5 generations among our employees, and I think that it's a very important aspect now, because the retirement is higher and higher in a lot of countries. So we should know who we are within our organization, and a lot of different. I think that there is no enough time for me, to speak about all of them.
That brings me to the next level in this discussion about evidence-based D&I. Suppose we have a lot of data, as many organizations do. Who is responsible for gathering, measurement, and perhaps the most important aspect, interpretation of the data? Who should it be?
Okay, so first we should start from gathering the data. So let's say that we already have the technology solution which will support us with this. So it will be simply easy, no matter how complex we are as an organization, how complex reporting related to IND we want to have. It just, to matter to have combined all of this information from different sources, like different HR systems. So then I think the best solution would be to have the different level of accessibility to those data, persons responsible for making sure that all data are gathered in the proper way, making sure that all calculations are done in a proper way, and also to make sure that we have prepared the dashboards or the graphs which we really need. And then if we all have, from this technical point of view, then we should have the PACE person who perfectly understand our business environment. Because I think that each organization should consider their IND data in the context of the business, to understand how we are progressing, and if these are the data we really need to understand our IND position, is first to understand also the business and the strategy of the company. So it should be the person, ideally from, IND team, someone who both understands how, for example, the technology works and how to analyze the data, and then who also understands the business context.
So it's someone who has an umbrella perspective on the organization, has a lot of know-how and analytical abilities to collect and interpret that information, and on top of that has enough psychological and emotional intelligence to detect the tiny little places in the organization that can become major shifts in the future. Is that the case?
Yes, but I think you know that the first part of the statement that you just mentioned, so this analytical skills, etc., etc., it can be easier when you have the proper technology, like Aware solution, for example, which in a really, really very visualized and very clear way present you different dimensions of inclusion and diversity. And then you just need to understand and feel the area of inclusion and diversity, understanding at the same time the strategy of your company. So this is really possible to have such person.
It is. Speaking of such person and the interpretation part of it, we all know that the old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, in the sense that should we have a clear sense of leadership when it comes to pushing whatever comes out of data interpretation within your organization, or should it be spread across, like for instance, the CEO or the top manager in any given structure should oversee the process, but at the same time the initiative should be mainly with the D&I officer or manager in the organization? How should it work?
I think that we have...
Okay. Yes, please go.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So I think we have two aspects here. So first, who is responsible for gathering, tracking, analyzing the data? And here I think that this responsibility can sit with a D&I officer, however, let's say we call this person in our organization. But the responsibility for the data is on whole managers, on the whole leadership of the company, because again, D&I metrics can not only sit with D&I. D&I improvement in D&I areas is not a D&I or HR responsibility. It's the responsibility of the whole leadership. Doesn't matter the structure in the companies. So two aspects: gathering, analyzing the data, and being responsible for the data.
That brings us to, I think Joanna wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, just wanted to add that building real and authentic, inclusive and diverse organization is not just a matter of who is responsible for the data analyzing and etc. etc. I think that the measures related to building this inclusive environment should be on all of us, all of members of organization. Of course, it depends on the level. There will be different measures given to the management and different levels of measures given to the employees. So the top management can have some hard KPIs, for example, targets, and each of the organization member can have some trainings, obligatory trainings to be done. So this is also the kind of measure.
Fair enough. Can we therefore refer to any obligatory KPIs in this area, and should we set targets along those lines?
We can, and we should. If we have the mindset, the proper mindset, if we understand that the inclusion diversity is important, if we have the proper and long-term strategy and framework around inclusion and diversity, so then we should set the bold goals which we want to reach. So why not? I know this is somehow controversial, and this is the matter of the proper communication about the goals and about the targets. But if we want to be somewhere, we need to measure it.
Speaking of actually your particular solution and wanting to implement even AI-driven data collection and interpretation systems, let's talk about the GDPR aspects of it. We all know that employees who share particularly sensitive information want to feel safe about it. So are there any best practices that companies should follow to comply with GDPR directive?
Generally speaking, to be compliant with GDPR directive, we need to make sure that we have the proper people who are dealing with sensitive data, then that we have the full range of politics, which make sure that the data are processed in a very secure way, and also that we have the technology enabling these policies to be fulfilled, and making it possible for the right people to run this. So I think that again, the right technology solution can be the answer for this aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Probably to GDPR technology can be very, very supportive. What I think we shouldn't miss from our rather is the organizational readiness for collecting certain information, right? So I will come back to the diversity or self-identification surveys that are one of the tools that we can use through the technology to collect data. And this is a topic and a tool being more and more often used. Very, very close to the German market, which differs from the Polish culture and environment. And here, the practice of running the self-ID surveys become more and more popular. Recently, I believe Adidas was the one to introduce that. And that's extremely important to make sure that the communication around that, the intentions, the security strategy, and the plans connected to that surveys, it's very clear to the employees. You can also use that survey as a proxy for educating people, because if we're all in our dominant group bubble, we rarely make an effort to educate ourselves in a broader perspective. And I found it quite fascinating how those self-ID surveys can be used as a learning tool at the same time. But that's a side comment. For me, communication and readiness of the company for doing that is essential before we start doing it.
Since we have less than 3 minutes left, I would leave you perhaps with one of the key questions to summarize this discussion. What would you recommend to companies at the beginning of their evidence-based approach to D&I? What should they be doing first without resorting to "it depends"?
So first, again, as we said, the D&I can support and should support the strategy of the company. So let's start with the strategy of the company. What are the main areas of focus? Because again, we are a business company. So first, strategy first, and then D&I metrics can only follow what are the main goals for our company. And it's not set one for forever. So the focus, we can have this year the focus on different D&I metrics, but our long-term strategy can lead us to measure different metrics in 5 years perspective, for example. So again, it's a personalized, it depends, it's a personalized choice of each company, and it should only support the strategy of the company.
So it should be always without exception strategically relevant to the company's vision of itself and its long-term goals. Joanna, would you like to add to that? What would you recommend to companies at the beginning of this road?
At the very beginning, and I would really suggest to use the experience of the companies who already, know perfectly how to set the long-term strategies, how to use the proper technology. Like, I don't know, like even, Accenture, we are also, having such services. So if we want to make sure that everything related to our strategy and that it will be live for a long, long time, I think it's the best solution to ask for some, professional service to support us to start with the journey.
Mm-hmm. Sandra, would you like to add anything?
I will just add some encouragement at the end, because we probably have to be aware of the audience listening to us. Not everyone coming from the large organizations. Some are smaller, mid-sized legacy companies. and each context is different. And the topic of D&I might be often overwhelming if we look at different diversity dimensions, how many they are. And then if we even on top of that want to add intersectionality of those dimensions, that becomes overwhelming. So if I could give one advice, would be don't get overwhelmed by that. Find one priority and start experimenting and learning from that, and then build on the strong fundamentals. Don't try to tackle everything at once, step by step, and you will get there.
Let me read out the few questions that our audience has shared with us. Maybe you would like to address some of them at least. We have very little time left again, I'm afraid. Tomasz, it's easier to measure diversity. The question is how to measure inclusion. Monika, can you share some examples of measures, metrics you have implemented? I agree with Tomasz, it's easier to measure diversity than inclusion. Antoni, what about measuring D&I during recruitment process? Inna, could you please share some examples of your own metrics? And Katarzyna, what D&I categories are you measuring in your companies? Feel free to address at least one or two of those questions, please.
So if I may start, perhaps from my side. So in Sodexo, we are focusing on 5 different D&I areas: gender balance, disabled people employment, generations, LGBT, cultures and origins. And then we have metrics in all 5 areas. Of course, some countries are more advanced, or their needs are different, and they are more focusing, for example, on gender balance or on refugees. It depends on the geography where they are. But again, we have set of metrics in all 5 areas, just to give you an example.
Mm-hmm. One question at least from Joanna and Sandra, maybe?
I will allow myself to tackle the topic of inclusion because I think, of course, diversity dimensions are more, I would say, tangible to a certain extent. On the other hand, we have enough tools available today to measure the inclusion too, right? So whenever the organization are having their engagement surveys in place, there is an option of introducing inclusion question to be able to measure where we sit with regards to that topic. We can always look for the proxy questions, and the proxy question was the example that that Monika gave around willingness to answer certain questions as a proxy to know if there is enough psychological safety to share those details. So we also can be creative in the way we look at our data, and from those proxy questions take some conclusions regarding the inclusion and belonging.
Thank
Yes,
you. And
finally, I
I
want to add something to this inclusion point. Yes, this is very true that it's much easier to have the tangible data related to diversity. But when we think about, for example, the fact that we have different groups of people in our organization, and when we can analyze the trends related, for example, to the attrition in particular groups, and that, for example, that we can see that after implementing some of actions related to support of some particular group, and that we can see, for example, that the attrition rate is decreasing, it also can be somehow the measure of the inclusiveness, I think.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think we've arrived at a point where all of us are absolutely clear that it's a complex topic, yet one definitely worth pursuing, taking all the risks into account, using data for evidence-based actions in D&I. Monika Bentkowska, Sodexo, Joanna Gembal, Accenture, Sandra, Subel, Axel, Springer. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.